All right, it says you are live. Hi, everyone. Eureka Cole, the church attorney here. So glad you're joining me today. I'm going to jump in on this topic of church property. We subtitle it Protecting One of Your Greatest Ministry Assets. But truly, one of the greatest assets the church may have is not necessarily the building. I know that might sound contradictory, but the biggest value may be the church's ability to make a wise decision about that property, right? About the facility, about your building. Church property can be a tremendous blessing. It can provide stability, visibility, room for ministry. It can be an asset that is around for decades, even centuries sometimes. So it really is a huge asset, and it is a goal. I have to say that most churches have. Most churches want to be able to secure their own facility, their own space. But I have to say, you've probably seen this as well, especially in these post-COVID years. We've seen that a church building can also become an expensive burden, one that over time can negatively impact a church's resources. It can restrict actually the same ministry work that the intention was for it to expand. And it keeps the congregation sometimes committed to yesterday's needs, right? Debt that was decided in the past instead of preparing for its mission for the future. So sometimes the hardest property decision is not whether the church can afford to buy a building. It's whether the church can afford to keep maybe the facility that it already has. And I know that that can be a hard discussion. It can be difficult to consider, maybe even that is an issue or could be realistically a challenge that you're facing. But today we're going to talk about some of the most consequential decisions that a church can make. So we're going to get into should we buy, like that whole discussion, some considerations around that, or continue renting, or even the possibility of selling if you're in that market. And we want to discuss whether the property could potentially help you generate additional revenue. We know that this is a highly inflationary environment. A lot of churches are having a difficult time. Some are absolutely flourishing, but some are trying to work through these questions, right? Even I want to touch on the possibility, or maybe whether you've considered merging with another church. When might that make sense? And how to protect the church legally and financially while making any of these decisions. Okay. So these decisions are really just about real estate. Even though church property, this is a commercial real estate matter. I was talking with another attorney today about a recent closing for a church. And we were talking about the fact that sometimes churches don't fully understand the logistics of a commercial real estate transaction. It's one of the most sophisticated legal transactions that there can be. Yet sometimes the focus can just be on maybe the excitement of gaining the property, but really it's a lot of legwork, and I want to get into it. So it involves stewardship, vision, governance, finances, legal risk, community impact, right? And often a great deal of emotion. So I remember being a part of a discussion with a church that had clearly outgrown its facility, which I think most churches will say is a good problem to have, but they were unwilling to really evaluate a shift or a change because a lot of the members just love the stained glass windows of this particular building. And so they just weren't willing to let it go. A church building may hold decades of memories. It's a place where their weddings, funerals, baptisms, revivals, children's programs, right? Sunday worship. And that history does matter. It is significant. But honoring the past does not always mean preserving the property in the exact same form. So sometimes protecting the legacy means making the hard decisions about the property and being real about the fact that the church building isn't God, right? It's an asset at the end of the day. So I want to help you begin asking the right questions before your church signs any kind of contract or accepts a loan or hires a broker, or even maybe from the leasing side approves a tenant or looks to become a tenant. Um, I want to make sure that you consider all these things before you announce, a decision that may not be easily reversed. And definitely stay with me, because as we get toward the end, I'm going to tell you about an upcoming webinar. Well, we'll go deeper into these issues, as well as inviting you to our 19th annual Church Law and Leadership Summit. Okay. So before we begin or go any further, I want to just remind you that I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. I'm here to provide general legal education, property laws, governing documents, tax rules, financing terms, denominational requirements, right? They differ. So your church should obtain legal, financial, tax, insurance, and real estate advice concerning its particular circumstances. Okay. So as a mom, I have many times said when my kids were younger, look before you leap, right? And we've heard that admonishment. It's a good thing. Making a property decision is likely one of the most important decisions a church will make. So let me give you a quick example. I got a call from a church that didn't have legal counsel in this process. They had identified a property. They were excited to be renting the property. And when they arrived at the property on Sunday, there was a red note on the door. They had been shut down. It had been secured before they even had their first service. Why? Because the property wasn't zoned as a church. These zoning issues can definitely get churches in trouble. And it's one of those things that you're not going to easily be aware of. In fact, they were getting the property from somebody who had prior used the property as a church. But unfortunately, the law caught up with this issue when the new tenant came in. And so they paid this money, signed this contract, and they were done. So really, this look before you leap. The building has to be able to serve the mission. Your church's property should serve its mission. The mission should not become the servants of the property, right? A building may have served a congregation beautifully for 50 years, but today that same church might be spending an increased percentage of its budget on repairs, on utilities, which we know those costs have gone up a lot, insurance, which we know has gone up a lot, securities, and maybe even deferred maintenance. So meanwhile, attendance may have changed. The congregation may be aging. The surrounding community may have changed. Programs may now be offered online or in other locations. The church may occupy only a small percentage of the property for much of the week. So no one wants to ask the difficult questions, but I just want to put it out there for us. Does the building still support where God is leading us? I think that's really important. And I'm not going to say it's easy, but I do think it's important. Instead, sometimes churches continue operating as they always have. And I want to make sure that we really use this as an opportunity to pause and do an examination, because change in property strategy is not a failure of ministry, right? Change in strategy is not a ministry failure. It just means we're going to still honor God, just going to do this in a different way. There's also another example. Guys know I've been working with churches for over 25 years. And technology continues to also change how things are done. So this insurance company used a drone to inspect property of its insurers, including this church. And ultimately, because of the work of this drone and what they were able to see in this property because of deferred maintenance, the insurance company canceled their contract with with the church. They said, we're no longer going to be able to provide you with insurance because you have these huge open repairs that need to be done, and we're out, right? So it making sure that your property still suits your purposes and that you can cover all of the expenses associated really is an act of stewardship. So just consider a church with a beautiful 40,000 square foot facility, but maybe they have 10 to 30 regular attendees. Its roof needs substantial repairs. The HVAC system is approaching the end of its useful life. Insurance premiums have increased. Several spaces are empty most of the week, right? On paper, the church may own a valuable asset. That's how it might look on paper, but operationally, the asset may be consuming the resources that the church needs to fulfill its actual mission. So the right question is not simply to ask, do we love this building, right? The better questions may be, does the property still advance our ministry? Is it cost sustainable? Are we using this property effectively? What major expenses are likely within the next 5 to 10 years, right? Being able to project that out. So you are not merely managing real estate, right? You're wanting to steward your ministry capacity and consider how it's serving your ministry today. So let me just cover maybe when buying may make sense, and then I want to talk about maybe when it doesn't. So the decision to buy, ownership, just like buying a home individually, it might make sense if the church has stable attendance, consistent giving, adequate financial reserves, capable leadership, and a clear long-term ministry plan. Buying often offers, advantages, right? So like stability, the church not being dependent on the landlord's willingness to renew a lease, right? That can feel unpredictable. It can allow the church to configure the space to work the way that you need it to work, right? Sometimes when you're renting a property, there are a lot of limitations on how you can change the functionality of different rooms and different spaces. It can provide greater visibility when you own a property, right? And more permanence in the community. And over time, that ownership might allow the church to build equity. But there is some caution, right? Churches sometimes can focus on whether they can make the mortgage payment and overlook the bigger picture, right? The Bible talks about counting up the cost. These are some of the costs to be considered, right? It's the closing cost of renovations, furniture, equipment, insurance, utilities, security, repairs, accessibility upgrades, if you need those specifically with an older congregation, any zoning matters or code compliance, roof and mechanical system replacement over time, and on and on and on, right? We want to make sure that we're doing the work to count up the cost. Now, given that, when might renting be wiser? Well, there's sometimes an assumption that renting is merely a temporary stage and like ownership is the ultimate like goal and when you've hit success, right? But that may not always be true. Renting might be the more strategic option. And I've talked with churches with high reserves, with high revenue, and they have decided as a ministry model to rent. So renting may be the more strategic option, even when the church is growing. But you want to make sure that you consider certain things even in the lease. So look at those zoning laws. Remember that example that I just shared with you, the permitted use of the space, the days and hours that you have access. Does the access correspond with what your needs are? What renewal options are there? Is it automatic renewal or what would the terms be? What is the rent increase likely to be? Has that been spelled out on the front end, or might you get surprises later? What are the insurance requirements and indemnification? And I want to say in both instances, whether you lease or whether you buy, somebody has to sign on the dotted line. Right. So I want to make sure that you go through the process that your church would require to determine who has the authorization to even make the decision to buy or to rent. I also want to always provide a caution around serving as the person who is maybe having to also secure the property with your own assets. Sometimes I've seen this was like a $8 to $10 million property that the church purchased, and the lender wanted the pastor and his wife to be personal guarantees, and they were going to just sign all these things without, well, thank God they ended up coming to me, and I was able to review and negotiate these things. But can you imagine being the personal guarantee on like a $8 to $10 million loan? Like, stress you out much, perhaps? It really probably changes how you might approach things at church, right? And we want to make sure that those are things that you consider. One of the things I want to talk about is maybe sharing or leasing an existing property. So I have another example of, there's a denomination that I had the pleasure of working with, and like many denominations, they were finding that they had sometimes properties that they needed to combine, and maybe not as many people in person. And so they had excess space, excess properties. I was able to connect a church that was looking for another campus with a denomination that was shedding property. And so it was a perfect scenario where I was able to just bring those two together where they had mutual benefit, right? Also, is there a church maybe that is compatible with you, or maybe a church that maybe they have their services on Saturday and your church has your services on Sunday, right? You could come together. Definitely, you want to make sure that you have a written agreement. You want to make sure that you dot all your I's and cross all your T's, but that might be a way to increase the usage of the property and bring in some cash for the church that owns the property. Now, I want to talk about merger being a part of the conversation. Mergers have been a part of businesses, since the beginning of time. But churches are now starting to see the fact that a merger could make sense. I've literally written a merger guide on church mergers because it is different, but the concept really stands firm. So I want to address perhaps one of the options to be considered in merger. A merger may make sense when two churches have complementary strengths and believe they can accomplish more together than separately. I've also seen mergers make a lot of sense when maybe a church has a location, but they want to expand to another location, but they don't necessarily want to have to, again, buy or rent something new. But there's already a church that's there that maybe they can partner with and grow and spread their reach in that way. So a successful merger requires more than just combining, right, the church building with another church's people. But you're going to be looking at theology and doctrine, leadership structure, obviously your governance and pastoral authority, staff and roles, and how those things may change. But it really is a fantastic way for churches to continue moving forward and being impactful. So I just want you to consider that if you find that maybe you want to expand your footprint in a certain way, or maybe you see that your church attendance is dwindling, but you still have a huge facility or a property there to consider. So as I sort of wrap up our time together, I want to give you a decision-making framework. Whether your church is considering buying, renting, selling, sharing space, or merging, I really want you to evaluate the decision through these 5 lenses. So just consider this. The mission, number 1. How will this decision advance the church's calling during the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because every church, I believe, while the goal is generally the same, to spread the gospel, right? But ultimately, the mission of your local church is going to be different than another church, right? So how will the decision that you make about church property advance the church's calling during the next 5 to 10 years? Look at that window. Money. So number 2, money. What is the total cost, right? Including the repairs, staffing, insurance, professional services, future obligations, right? Put it all in there. And what happens under a less favorable financial scenario? Does the property still make sense? Number 3, authority. This is where I help churches a lot. Who has the legal and governing authority to approve these kinds of decisions? What do the bylaws say? Your loan documents? If you're a part of the denomination, what are the denominational rules? What does state law require, right? Working through that authority component is critical. Number 4 in this decision-making framework is, what are the risks? Whether they're legal or tax or insurance or zoning, employment, safety, and operational risk have to be addressed. Hi, Mr. Reeves, I see your question. I will definitely get to that. And number 5, the people. How will the decision affect members, staff, tenants, community partners, and the surrounding neighborhood? How will the leadership communicate the decision? So these are all big questions that I want you to answer. And today's conversation is only the beginning. Church property isn't just about bricks and mortars. Obviously, it's about protecting the people. It's where ministry happens, and it's about furthering that ministry heart. So when churches are proactive instead of reactive, they are better positioned to serve their congregation and communities. We have an amazing webinar that's going to hit on this a bit more than I have time to do today. But this is actually one of the topics that we'll be discussing at my upcoming free webinar. It's the 5 topics impacting church growth, what every church leader needs to know right now. It's on Tuesday, July 28th at noon Eastern. And we'll not only be talking about church property, but other critical areas, including artificial intelligence, youth ministry, leadership and succession, that whole point of transitions, and building healthy ministry teams, because we are looking forward to ultimately our 19th annual Church Law and Leadership Summit, and we would love to have you there. Okay, so all the links are in the comments, and I don't know if this is Pastor Reeves, but let me answer your question. You say, hello, what are the advantages of a church having a director of safety management? What's benefits of disadvantage? The benefits versus disadvantages. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, so I think, every church, certainly today, has to consider safety. I feel like I did an entire podcast episode. I know that I did. I did a podcast episode dedicated to church safety, and it's one of those conversations that I have regularly. And I would say that building church safety into your property considerations is critical. No matter where you are, you want to be able to have a safety plan to manage both things externally and things internally. So I would definitely say that having a plan is important. Having someone to oversee that plan is also key, whether that's their title or something else. I think that can be flexible, but I definitely think that managing church safety is critical. And we've seen, unfortunately, some tragedies that involve a lack of safety at church. So I'm always going to be a proponent for that. Thanks for your question. Again, I would love to see you all join us at next week's free webinar. Again, it's Tuesday, July 28th. The link is in the comments. And also in September, we have an amazing online event. It's our 19th year of having the Church Law and Leadership Summit. It's a power-packed time. We cover all these areas. I think it's the only conference of its sort where we bring legal, tax, insurance, finance, property matters, just all under one roof. Some amazing speakers and sponsors. So I would love for you to be there. Join all the other church leaders around the nation who've already signed up. And I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless. Bye.